A very common criticism of Jujutsu Kaisen is that the pacing of the story can be too fast, diluting the impact of deaths of beloved characters within it through often swiftly moving past them without much reflection and dwelling, and sometimes not even building up characters enough to feel for them before they die. In Shibuya, we have several pivotal deaths to various members of the cast, and particularly for characters on the protagonistic side, it often feels like it's too quick to take in. Nanami and seemingly Nobara die, in combination with Gojo disappearing in the prison realm, but we are forced to move on. Jogo dies, and Mahito dies at the end as arguably the primary villain of the arc, but nothing about his death is dwelt on as he is pathetically absorbed and Kenjaku brings about a whole new world order. And as we did with everything else, we swiftly move on. And later on in Shinjuku, the same thing happens to a greater extent. In the gauntlet against Sukuna, character after character perishes in the relentless endurance match against him. Gojo, Kashimo, Choso, Higuruma, Yuki too beforehand, and even one of the most important characters in the story in Kenjaku died after his ascension with Takaba. And despite the gravity of them, we very rarely get a chance to properly sit with these deaths before the battle continues. Simply put, Gege isn't at all afraid to kill these important characters off, but Jujutsu Kaisen's pacing isn't particularly interested in dwelling in ways that traditionally supplement fictional deaths. And this very much isn't an unintentional mistake on Gege's part. It is a deliberate stylistic element of the story that integrates with the themes of the work. That the world is simply too cruel and overwhelming and violent, an element that shaped Sukuna's ideology and is reflected back and reinforced by him, for anything to linger. The world is a mass of constant bloodshed, and so the story does not dwell because there is always another conflict ahead. And while you can achieve that with some leeway to allow for reflections on these character deaths, Gege is seemingly determined to very often not allow the story to breathe much, especially from Shibuya onwards. So Jujutsu Kaisen does not spare our protagonists the opportunity to grieve for their fallen loved ones, and at times doesn't even allow for the characters to be built up much. Gege wants the story to reflect this cruel torrent and the reader to feel it, and so the story's pacing is often fast and unrelenting to reflect this thematic desire in Jujutsu Kaisen's structure. One of the primary points in my video on Yuji is that death in this setting is so cruel that it leaves Yuji unable to properly process it and willing to self-sacrifice in a detrimental way to force some meaning onto the deaths of his loved ones because the world is too brutal to allow for there to be some otherwise, seemingly. Nanami is killed and then the world moves on. Shibuya is leveled and the world moves on. Nobara is seemingly killed and the world moves on, and Yuji feels it to be barbaric that no one acknowledges their struggles and that the setting doesn't pause for them when he feels it should. So he overcompensates by trying to attribute a meaning to their deaths, trying to make it so that their final act was one defining of his feelings for them. But sometimes there isn't a meaning in death, and trying to find it is often self-destructive and misrepresentative. As Todo says, the best way to honor them is to carry their torch and continue the fight as the person they held such trust in. Their meaning was in their lives and the way they lived, and it is carried forth in the beating hearts of those left behind. So as beautiful as it would be for Nanami to have a 5-chapter remembrance, the world is too cruel for that. The story constrains the possibilities, and Yuji and us must conform to it and seek meaning for those deaths in an unorthodox way that isn't as fulfilling as we'd like. Just as Yuji conforms to Sukuna's worldview and defeats him on his terms to prove him wrong. And speaking of Sukuna, it can be argued that in this vein, the death that gets the most reflection and breathing time and overall respite surrounding it is ironically his. Both shortly before and after his death, we get an internalization with Sukuna similar to what we get with the likes of Gojo, Nobara, and Nanami, but to a greater extent. In the moment prior, a quiet dissection of his psyche and dynamic with Yuji, and afterwards, a short but very rich reflection from him on all that his life was. And this makes sense considering what we've discussed. It's a natural end-of-series exhale, but likewise, it's no coincidence that once the individual who shaped the world that shaped the story is gone, we can finally breathe. Because now the world has changed, and as such, the story has changed right at the end. Sukuna, the epitome of strength, shaped the story and bent it to his will and philosophy, and naturally Sukuna does not allow for time to pause for the deaths of such lower beings, or for death at all. But once he dies, that shifts just a bit to reflect Yuji a little more, and we can see that Jujutsu Kaisen was a story begging in vain to reflect on the souls within it. Clearly it's something that Gege felt incredibly strongly about to sacrifice what I'm sure they would have liked to write for the sake of there being synchronicity between the world the story portrays and the story being portrayed. Because what better way is there to sell that this world is so relentless and cruel than not being able to properly have time to grieve? Now, to be clear, I am explaining the intent here, but intent alone does not at all automatically mean that it's good. It depends on the execution, as everything does, and it is up to the reader or watcher to decide for themselves if that execution is good or worth the very abstract and bold ideas here. It's all very well and good for Gege to set out to have this reason for why the pacing is so fast, why there aren't many moments to breathe, why deaths aren't dwelt on much, and why slice-of-life character bonding moments rarely happen beyond the first arc or two. But ideas alone don't make stories. And speaking honestly, I've definitely felt my own enjoyment of Jujutsu Kaisen negatively affected by having characters die when I didn't feel super connected to them, or by having the story move on quickly after a death when I would have felt it more if it lingered. I've sometimes found myself feeling that I would better enjoy the story if it was able to reflect on itself a bit more. But the thing is, I can't expect any given story to perfectly accommodate me. I can't expect every narrative flourish to benefit my sensibilities. And this isn't me attempting to say that because of its intent, the series' pacing is beyond criticizing, because it absolutely isn't, and I actually think that there are flaws embedded in this approach. If the intended style of your story bypasses respite and reflection, it is hugely risky that people will have trouble connecting with your work. And there are times in Jujutsu Kaisen where I feel a disconnect occasionally. But at the same time, the positives vastly outweigh the negatives, and to me the story more than compensates with this through the way it's able to build characterization through conflict and fights and action, and indirect storytelling through mechanics to make the majority of these negatives worth it, and the majority of these deaths feel earned and authentic. That, and I truly do love the vast majority of the final moments of these characters enough to feel immensely at their deaths, even if they feel very much like the calm at the eye of a breathless storm. One of Gege's greatest strengths to me is effectively establishing rich dynamics and characterization very quickly and efficiently, and this strength is tailored perfectly for this intent with the pacing. I'm sure there are ways to get across these themes and ideas in a way that may allow for more character reflection, but that simply isn't the way that Gege wanted to execute this. And in Gege's eyes, to be able to dwell would be undercutting the intent and vision of the story. It would be undercutting Yuji's struggle. Gege has a stylistic, thematic idea here reflected very strongly in the structure of the story, and the narrative lives and dies by this creative vision. Now, is it a perfect idea that the very thematics of a story where death is everywhere dictate that you don't really feel the deaths as much as you wish you could sometimes? That you aren't connected to some characters and don't feel as much as you wish you would at times due to a lack of quiet character building? Of course it isn't perfect. Jujutsu Kaisen has a very distinct creative vision, and it is incredibly conceptually impressive, but it is a double-edged sword that by its very nature can alienate some of the audience. But I would rather have a story I love but am sometimes frustrated by that properly reflects the philosophy and vision of its creator than one that is perfectly tailored to my tastes that isn't as reflective of its creator and isn't as bold thematically, one where that creator had to compromise. If this pacing and structure of Jujutsu Kaisen simply doesn't work for you, then fair enough. I doubt there is anyone in the world that considers this story perfect. I certainly don't. In laying out these ideas behind the style of the narrative, I only mean to explain that this is a very deliberate element of Jujutsu Kaisen that merges thematics and narrative with the way that it's paced and structured. But I'm not trying to say that this means that it is beyond criticism. It's up to each individual to decide whether the benefits outweigh the costs, but speaking for myself, the amount of substance I see in the story and the amount of admiration I have for this vision and how bold it is far outweighs the gripes I have. And even if that wasn't the case, This is Gege's story, and I wouldn't want that vision compromised. I'm perfectly okay with not rocking with a story if it means that the creator is able to set forth their objective. Not everything needs to appeal to me. Fitting with the eccentricities of its creator, Jujutsu Kaisen's pacing is all at once frustratingly flawed considering what most people like to get out of a story, and simultaneously, it is also perfect for the intent of the story. And while inherently imperfect, I wouldn't have it any other way. Many thanks for watching.